Hey guys, I'm Chad Hoover. Welcome to Monster Bass, where I'm going to show you how to use a Carolina rig as a search bait. All right guys, let me show you how to set up a Carolina rig. There's a lot of different ways to set up a Carolina rig, or as they call it, the old ball and chain. There really isn't a wrong way to set it up, so I'm going to show you how I set mine up and why. First and foremost, I start with a tungsten weight. I just think tungsten's the best for feel. It's also the heaviest for the size. So in other words, you get more weight out of the size, so it punches down there faster. And behind my tungsten weight, I always do some kind of brass or metal, clacker. That way when that tungsten ticks against it, it makes noise. And then behind that, I put a piece of glass. So I just say tungsten, brass, then glass. And then I always put a bead right before my knot. And the reason for that is glass beads have a tendency to nick your knot. And so I know a lot of people break off Carolina rigs, and when you put those glass beads on there, that hole going through there has a sharp edge on it. And so when it goes up against the knot, it has a tendency to rub back and forth and ultimately make that knot fail. So again, the way I set mine up was with a tungsten bullet weight, a brass slider, a glass bead to give it a little bit of a higher pitch click, and then I put a bead on there, just a plastic bead, to protect that knot. And then that way when you move it, it gives it that clicking noise. From there, I just tie basically a straight swivel on. I do a Palomar knot on both sides. I usually start with a longer leader and shorten it as necessary. It's a lot easier to shorten it than it is to lengthen it. It's kind of like a bad haircut. But here's one of the tricks that I use on a Carolina rig, especially with a buoyant bait. I like to rig the hook a little further back in the bait. And the reason for that is the weight of the hook will make that bait fall. And so if you rig the hook a little further back into the bait, then when you Texpose it, it falls a little more horizontal, falls a little bit more natural, and it hangs in the water column a little bit longer. And then when you snatch that bait, it jerks it down, and then when you stop reeling, it just kind of raises up off the bottom. So again, if you're fishing over wood, mussel beds, scattered, any type of cover, or if you're fishing it in grass, when the weight gets down in the grass, that bait will float up just above the grass. When you drag it along, that bait goes down, hits the top of that grass, and just floats up. So that right there is a deadly effective way to find fish. Okay, I'm not a big fan of continuing to fish the Carolina rig just to put fish up. I like to use this to find the fish. Once I find the fish, I'm going to switch to something more compact, like a Texas rig, a jig, and in a lot of cases even go to a crankbait that's going to hit and stay at that specific depth. So the biggest problems I hear from people fishing with a Carolina rig is they have a hard time casting it. That's why a lot of times I just lob it out, and then I use my motor or paddle, let a line out, and then turn around and fish it back to me. That avoids that. And then the other thing is I don't peg my weight. A lot of folks like to put this thing where it's pegged in the front, or they like to use the Carolina rigs that are pre-rigged to where it doesn't slide. And I'm going to tell you why I don't do that. When that bait hits the bottom and that bass grabs that bait, I want it to be able to swim away without feeling me. So if that thing is pegged, it's going to feel that weight, or it's going to drag that weight first, and I'm not going to be able to feel it before it feels me. The other reason that I don't like to peg it is I like to let the fish swim with it a little bit, and then when I set the hook, that line goes through there and moves that. When you've got this thing pegged, you've actually got to move the whole weight to set the hook. And if the bait's up here and your rod tip's up there, you've got to make up all that distance to set the hook. So I'm a big fan of letting my whole rig slide, make a lob cast, or just drop it down, paddle away, motor away, and then work it back to me. So I'm going to show you how to fish a Carolina rig as a search bait. The first thing that I like to do is make a long sweeping cast. Okay, so I use my weight and I get the bait way out there as far as I can, and then I feed some line out. That way it gets to the bottom as fast as it possibly can. So when I'm fishing a Carolina rig, especially as a search bait, I like to move it with the rod until I'm straight ahead, and then come back and then reel up my slack. And the reason that I like to do that is that weight is ticking along the bottom and kicking up silt. It's getting those fish's attention, and then that bait is floating up into the strike zone. So if I've got my hand on the reel and that fish hits it, it feels me, or I feel it. So if I'm doing this just like this, and then that fish hits it, I can give it back a little bit of line, and if I give it back a little bit of line, it lets that bait float up, go down, scoot, 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 give it back some slack, and if that fish hits it, again, it hits it on a slack line, it turns to swim away, and pretty much hooks itself. So I'm a big fan of fishing the Carolina rig more, taking the rod, pointing it at the cast. When it hits the bottom, bump it along, move the rig with the rod, not the reel. Bring your rod back, reel up your slack, and do it again. And then once you get close to the boat, just do that all over again. Now, one thing to keep in mind is with the Carolina rig, when you set the hook, you really need to do a sweeping hook set, because in many cases the line is going down to the weight, through the weight, and then up to the bait. So if you don't take up that slack, you may not get a good hook set, because once that swivel hits the weight, it stops and that fish may not get hooked. So you really do need to do a good sweeping hook set, which is why I'm a big fan of reeling back to the fish, pointing your rod at it, and then using a whole torso rotation to set the hook. Now, I use this presentation in a lot of situations, but as a kayak angler, I actually like to fish a Carolina rig one-handed. So what I'll do is, after I get my rod even with my kayak, I'll just reel up my slack with my middle finger, turning the star drag, and then bring it back along, pause for a second, give that line back, let that bait float up a bit, reel up your slack. As you're pointing it back in the direction of the lure, bring it along, give it back some slack. And again, I think the most important part of fishing this Carolina rig, especially as a search bait, is to give it back that slack and let that bait raise up in the water column. And man, a lot of times when you get ready to pull it again, that fish has already got it, and then you just stick it, which is also why you want to be out here so that you've got room to set the hook instead of reeling it constantly. And if the fish hits it, you're here and you don't really got anywhere to go. The Carolina rig for me has become more of a, I'm on a new fishery, I want to check out the bottom composition, I want to find fish, I want to find out where the fish are, and then for the most part, after I catch them on a Carolina rig, I usually switch to something else that's a little bit more compact, like a Texas rig, or I'll switch to a jig. In fact, about 95% of the time, if I find them on a Carolina rig, I'm going to turn around and go to a Texas rig or a jig after that, and then that usually produces more fish for me over the long haul.